morning and good evening to all of you who are joining us from the far side of the planet. We've organized this virtual panel to talk about the intensifying tech wars and specifically what they mean for the countries of the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the US, and their long twilight struggle over the next order in the Indo-Pacific and indeed globally. 2 years ago, we launched this Hudson Initiative on Geo-Tech in the Quad at a conference in Tokyo that was chaired by Mr. Chandrasekhar, a member of India's parliament who is here with us today. In his keynote, Mr. Chandrasekhar noted that the future will be defined by technology, and those that control technology will control the world. It is fair to say that China's Communist Party grasped the geopolitical significance of key emerging data technologies well before most policymakers in the world's advanced democracies did. The PRC has, over the last 8 years, launched a many-faceted bid to give the world a new operating system and to try to control the digital infrastructure through which the world's data will flow. Through massive IP theft, in some cases, sales of key technologies from democracies to China, and through state subsidy of its own data tech sector, the Communist Party has set about to transform itself into a new kind of technological superpower. The PRC's national champions have since come to dominate the rollout of 5G networks in dozens of countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa. The US is concerned that this is making countries more vulnerable to PRC surveillance, espionage, and political manipulation are now well established, and the US has undertaken a worldwide effort to deny the PRC from making for itself tech dependencies. Many other democracies have begun a reappraisal and a deep recalibration of their national policies. A little over 1 month ago, after the PRC's military incursions into India's Galwan Valley, New Delhi has taken bold actions to reassert its own sovereignty over the Indian data and tech sector and to limit unwanted PRC influence in these areas. More such moves by India can be expected. Without this, as the Sunday Guardian's Madhav Nalapat has argued, 90% of Indian-made metadata would seamlessly flow to Chinese entities in 2024. The intensifying battles over geotech are, yes, fundamentally about national security, economic competitiveness, and dominance of the vital industries of the future. But they are also about the future of Republican self-government and over international order. One of the core assumptions of modern democracy is that technological progress can, with rule of law, be made to serve the proper ends of political life, including civic peace and human prosperity. But the PRC is intent on creating a new model of digital tyranny, one that serves the ruling party's ends. Inside the PRC empire itself, from Xinjiang all the way to Hong Kong, Beijing is already harnessing data tech to subjugate its own people and to construct the most advanced police state ever known. Externally, Beijing aims to build a more supportive world order for its form of government and to strip away the advantages that the democracies have enjoyed over the last 200 years. These are, in their deepest sense, epoch-making issues that the world's democracies will need to contend with together as an alliance. We're here today to discuss all this, and in particular, the practical ways that like-minded democracies and other nations in the Indo-Pacific and beyond can maintain democratic leadership over the critical technologies of the future. We have a distinguished panel of speakers from all over the Indo-Pacific. We're going to hear first from Mr. Rajeev Chandrasekhar, the noted technology strategist, entrepreneur, and Indian public servant. Next, we will hear from Tom Duesterberg, my colleague at Hudson Institute and an expert on international trade and economic policy, who has been doing quite a bit of work on telecoms and 5G policy. Then we'll hear from Sada ITO, who's the former chief director of the Information Policy Bureau in Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. Sada-san has extensive career experience in trade, energy, and in digital policies, as well as AI and geopolitics. And last, we'll hear from my good colleague, John Lee, also a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and a former national security advisor to Australia's Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. Thank you all. With that, we'll go over to Mr. Rajeev.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for having me over this evening and your morning. Look, before I launch into why I think technology is important, I just want to maybe set this up in a certain context, because ever since COVID, this unprecedented crisis has hit the world. It's given a lot of people a lot of time to think about what this all means, what the nature of the changes that are facing us are going to be. And it hasn't hurt that a lot of us are sitting at home, locked down, and having plenty of time to ponder what the last 50 years have created and what the next 50 years ought to be. Look, I think it's clear and it's quite unarguable that we are seeing what is unprecedented in terms of what COVID-19 represents. There are huge questions over the role of China and the spread of the virus. There is a sudden death of a half-century-old US-China engagement, a huge disturbance in global relationships and multilateral institutions that that are sort of threatening their very existence. The unprecedented decoupling of the developed world from China, an ongoing process, but clearly underway. And this mindless and inexplicable belligerence of China on India, on issues of India, on issues of Hong Kong, on the South China Sea, all of which are altering the present world order. I mean, I think there's absolutely no argument that we are in the midst of some tectonic changes. We don't know the real outcome of that yet, but the change is underway, is completely unquestionable. And so before, this is yet another opportunity, Eric, for me to talk about technology. And you know that I've been talking about this for many years. And I just want to lay out 4 or 5 examples or empirical facts or empirical historical facts about China's conduct and how China saw the technology space and the internet way earlier than the rest of the world. In 2010, 2011, and I don't know if anybody recalls this, there was this attempt by China to move the regulation of the internet from the ICANN to a United Nations body called the UN SERP. So we would have had the internet, which is a free, open entity of ideas, technologies, and innovation, suddenly get regulated by a group of bureaucrats sitting in the United Nations. And we know now, after the WHO incident, the extraordinary amount of influence that China has on United Nations institutions. That process of moving the internet regulation from the ICANN to UN SERP almost went through. And funnily enough, India was alongside China at that time. And there was only, at that time, I was the one who saw that, and I raised a shindig in the Indian Parliament, and we backed off of that. I'm just raising that as an example of how early on China saw the power, the power of being able to regulate the internet, the benefits of it being able to control the internet and technology. There are many other examples. I heard the FBI director that day at the Hudson event talking about how technology has flowed back to China. I worked early on in my entrepreneurial career with a company called Nortel in Canada. And it was one of those great companies that did some great work in the fiber space and the radio space. And one day the company just disappeared. It went bankrupt. And the next thing we knew, the entire technology and intellectual property that company had built over years had suddenly found itself in Huawei. I'm giving you this as a backdrop. The second point I just want to just make here before I get into this issue of technology is this issue about why did China get to where it has reached? And I think this is very important to understand before we get into architecting the future. Because China, 50 years ago or 45 years ago, as the math goes, China is a creation of the US. China today, and I say this without meaning to be rude or it's just a historical fact. China, an absolute Marxist country, pretended to be a market economy and got out of the socialist bracket because of the whole Cold War dynamics. And so if today somebody asks me sitting in India, or Ito-san sitting in Japan, or John sitting in Australia, what is the prime mover behind China's rise? It is clearly, more than any other nation, any other reason, it's the US and the geopolitics of the Cold War that created China as a countervailing power to the then USSR, and of course then Russia. We must understand that to understand how we will address the future. So I'm just leaving this out for you to think about, because that and the WTO, these two things have helped create the China of today. And the China of today, we all can today agree on many things and disagree on many things, but we will all agree that China does represent a challenge to all the free people of the world, and the open economies and the open democracies of the world, in not just technology, even in terms of trade and economy. I mean, we're talking about this country representing a reasonably significant challenge now to us. It is in this context that we have to talk about why it is so important that the next big economic drive, the biggest driver for the economies of the future is going to be technology. And technology is not just about an academic discussion about intellectual, who's done great work and innovation and patents and Nobel Prizes and scientists and scientific discoveries. It's really to do with the shape, nature, and size of the future economy. And I think technology is equal to economy, is equal to a new way of managing these global relationships between nations in the future, is the construct that I put out there. And I would like to discuss this more as we go forward, but I wanted to start by presenting an historical context of why we are where we are. And if we have to solve this and be more secure about going forward in the future, we have to architect almost a brand new construct in terms of relationships between nations, institutional and bilateral.
Thank you very much, Rajeev. Let's go to Tom, because I know that he's given quite a bit of thought to this, including as it pertains to 5G policy. Tom?
So thanks, Eric and Rajeev, for setting the table for this discussion in a very interesting way. My point of view is that China poses not only an economic challenge to the United States, but also a governance challenge. And I think Eric explained that well to start with. I'm going to focus a little bit on how I think those of us here today, Australia, Japan, the United States, and India can possibly work together, because I think China is a big enough challenge that, especially in the technology sphere, where China has, at least in the telecommunications sphere, established the sort of dominance that is going to require some cooperation to fight back on. It's important to include India in this discussion, not only because it's technologically very advanced, but it's the largest telecommunication market in the world, I think, by number of users. My point of view is that what we need to avoid is a lapse into some sort of competitive autarkies in the global economy. There is a danger of this, and partly because of the COVID. You can see this evolving in the United States. You can see thinking evolve in Europe as well. Even Japan has set out a new fund to help bring production back to Japan. I'd like to see if we can find ways to work together, especially in the telecommunications sphere. So, and I'm going to focus a bit on the Indian market, and I'm going to ask Rajeev to correct me if my understanding of how things are evolving in India a little off the mark. But it appears that, I mean, India is the largest telecom market. In terms of hardware, if you will, the backbone, the infrastructure, I think what we need to do collectively, including in India, is to find an alternative to Huawei. I mean, we have Nokia, we have Ericsson, we have Samsung now. Reliance Jio claims to have a integrated system for 5G that they're ready to start offering. It appears that in the other part of the hardware market is cell phones themselves, and in India at least, Chinese makers seem to dominate that market, although the higher end phones of Samsung, Apple and the like are gaining ground somewhat, and Indian providers are starting to be active there as well. I think what we want to avoid, not only in India, but in the rest of the world as well, is creating another totally integrated, closed system like we have now emerging with 5G. Huawei has perfected this system. They subsidize the production. They've got all the technology they need. They've acquired it one way or another, legitimately, sometimes illegitimately. But they offer a low-cost system. They'll give you zero financing to put it into place. There is an emerging technology that I think merits close attention, not only in India, but in the United States and other countries as well, which comes under various names: open radio access networks, virtualized networks. These are open systems where a number of vendors can produce products and software for the markets. It avoids the vertically integrated systems that allow a company like Huawei to dominate, and it makes it hard to get out of the system once you put it into place. It appears that Reliance Jio's 5G offering, as far as I can tell, contains a significant number of elements of virtualized networks. These avoid the hardware backbone and replace it with cloud-based, software-based communications systems. They're much more flexible. They allow more players into the field, and therefore they allow, they're much more agile and can allow for a lot more innovation. Bharti Airtel also is apparently offering in several cities in India virtualized networks. Our Japanese friends, Rakuten, is one of the major really experiments with totally virtualized systems. It's working in cooperation with Cisco, Intel, Altiostar, and other American-based companies. So there is a synergy, I think, between American, Indian, Japanese firms. European firms can be involved in this as well. So I think that that path is one that we ought to think about and actively pursue. And again, we need to avoid, I think, trying to create national champions on our own, because I think there's plenty of technological expertise scattered around the free world that can be a powerful alternative to Huawei's offerings. Let me just briefly mention one other issue that has come to the fore. Rajeev mentioned this with the clashes in northern India. India has decided to push back against Huawei and other Chinese software system. It's banned most of the social platforms of China in India. The United States is going down that path as well. We're currently working against to remove TikTok as a Chinese-owned operator in the United States, and I think that's going to result in TikTok being banned from the United States unless it's owned by an American company. This raises a larger question, I think, what I think Eric and Rajeev both mentioned, how we're going to treat data going forward. Big data is obviously the key to many, many technologies of the future. We had started to go down, the West, if you will, started to go down a path of fairly open cross-border transfers of data, but led by the Europeans, and the privacy concerns of the Europeans, we are moving in a different direction, I think, and we need to come up with a better solution. Now, I think the privacy concerns are well articulated. The Europeans Court of Justice just banned basically the strategy that US, Japanese firms had used to protect data flows between Europe and Japan, United States. So we have to find another system. The Japan-European trade agreement was basically silent on cross-border data flows. The US and Japan have been open about trying to protect data flows. One thing we ought to think about perhaps is in the era of the Internet of Things, where cross-border data flows for business is an economic imperative. You cannot have transnational corporations operating effectively in an era of the Internet of Things unless we have some protection for allowing the sharing of data. So that's on the agenda for, I think, working together to find a solution. Again, China already going down the path of autarky in terms of data. It's the biggest data market in the world, so that gives them incredible economic advantage in many, many technologies of the future. So I just put that on the table as something we ought to think about. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tom. Mr. Chandrasekhar, did you want to respond to some of Tom's observations?
Yeah, no, so Tom, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is an instinctive move towards a competitive autarky, and it won't be Huawei's system. It'll be an Indian system, or it'll be a Japanese system, or it'll be an Australian system. And and that's precisely why I believe that when we look at the future, we have to figure out a way that there is an institutional way of evolving the policy framework for issues like cross-border data flows, for example. A lot of this is getting negotiated. As you saw between the EU and the US, we have this setback. We have a data protection law that's under consultation in Parliament, and I'm on the Joint Parliamentary Committee. And these are some of the similar issues that we are grappling with. I personally think that between these nations, for example, starting with the Quad, we ought to have a broad-based principles approach on what ought to be the do's and don'ts about data flow. Because cross-border data flow is absolutely imperative for development of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all of those technologies that various companies around these 4 countries are doing. But that balanced against privacy and data protection comes up against an immovable object meeting a hard wall. So I believe there has to be an institutional mechanism to handle that between the 4 countries or 5 countries, as the case may be. The second, I completely agree with you that the virtualized networks way is the way to go. And it ought to be more co-development between companies and countries that share the same value system and the same ideologies. It makes no sense, for example, Japan, Australia, India, and the US to all come up with their own systems and then find themselves being uncompetitive in terms of either scale or in terms of innovation and quality. So I'm completely agreed with Tom on the need for these two issues to be central to discussing the future of cooperation in technology and the future vision of technology for democracies of the world.
Thank you. I know a few other people who have given such deep thought to the question of data governance as Sada-san. So perhaps we can hear from you next, Sada.
Sure. So thank you, Eric, for hosting this great event. And thank you for Rajeev-san and Thomas-san for great insights. So I'm originally from METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, and the digital policy and the geotechnology are my field of specialty. So I'm gonna touch upon geotechnology and data free flow related developments in Japan. And also I would like to kind of explore the potential of Quad as a venue to explore the cooperation in this arena. I think maybe I should begin with G20 Osaka Leaders Summit, which we hosted last year actually, and which I was personally involved, and I was in charge of the digital portion of the leader statement. I think G20 Osaka was phenomenal because it was essentially the first occasion where the leaders discussed and kind of emerged as a priority of the digital governance. There were two key messages from G20 Osaka. One was data free flow with trust, and another was the concept of human-centric AI. So as Thomas-san correctly mentioned, data free flow is so essential in this digital economy. Data is 21st century oil. But free flow is not for free. We have to make efforts to ensure free flow of data. In light of this, I think what is at stake is trust. That's why we call data free flow with trust. And when we say trust, I think there are two pillars. The first is how we deal with privacy, as Thomas-san mentioned. And the second is how we deal with security. So with these two common ground of trust comprised of privacy and security among trusted partnership, we have to build upon the trust. And without this kind of the basis of trust, data free flow will be too vulnerable to be taken advantage by the authoritarian regime. So we need trust here. And with regard to the second topic of human-centric AI, here again, the key phrase will be trust. And as a kind of casual topic, for those familiar with Japanese pop culture and cartoons, as Eric-san knows very well, there's a very popular Japanese animated character called Doraemon. Doraemon is a kind of the cat type AI robot. It's very popular. And it's kind of classic. It first appeared in Japan in the year 1969. So every Japanese kid has grown up with Doraemon. It's like Snoopy or Mickey Mouse. And the main character of the comic is a human boy called Nobita, a lazy boy. And Nobita asks Doraemon for help whenever he's in trouble. And this Doraemon, the cat-type robot, AI actually, has all sorts of great technology in his magical pocket by which he can help Nobita. And what's good about this story is with help by Doraemon, Nobita, the human boy, overcomes hurdles and eventually he grows by himself. And I illustrate this example as a perfect example of the notion of co-evolution between human and AI, both growing up. And also the notion of technology to help people, not to control people. I think that will be a kind of starting point in the discussions in which we have to kind of focus on this geotechnology competition in this modern era. And prominent feature of the latest digital economy is increasing integration of physical domain and cyber domain. So what I just described with regard to data and AI applies to physical arena as well, such as 5G and semiconductor supply chain. So here again, I think the key concept, key driver will be trust. In Japan, we just passed a law to give tax incentive for 5G network where you procure from trusted suppliers. Whether those suppliers are Japanese or non-Japanese firms. And as again, Thomas-san correctly pointed out, there has been an emerging global alliance among these trusted suppliers. And METI also has a jurisdiction over export control and investment screening. So we are trying to tighten up our efforts on economic security as well. So both in physical domain and cyber domain, I think this partnership among like-minded countries is so essential. And today in this panel, we have speakers from US, India, Australia, and Japan, which accidentally consists of Quad, as Ericsson originally kind of planned. And it was Prime Minister Abe of Japan who first proposed the concept of Quad back in year 2006, actually. And this is not a solid military alliance. This is not anti-anybody, but this is a kind of the efforts to reinforce each other's strengths. And METI has been quite active in building trust with Quad partners. And especially, specifically, as Rajeev-san mentioned, I think India will play a vital role in this Quad efforts because of their geotechnology capability. And I think this Quad can lay the solid ground for digital and geotechnology policy coordination, which will serve as a kind of the basic infrastructure under this post-COVID paradigm. So I will stop here and look forward to further discussion. And thank you again for this great occasion. So back to you, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, Sada-san. Thank you very much. John, let's go to you, and then we can have a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. You know, I travel around, particularly in Southeast Asia, quite a lot. So now, in my current capacity now as a Hudson Senior Fellow, but also before when I was in government, speaking about lots of these issues. And when you raise this Geo-Tech competition or rivalry that's occurring, the general response you get from a lot of countries in the region is, look, we are technology takers, not makers. We are price takers, we're not price makers. Our markets are too small to really influence behavior or policy. And besides, this whole Geo-Tech competition is just part of a broader US-China competition, which is just a part of normal international relations. So that's a lot of the response that I tend to get, you know, when I talk to people about these issues. So I thought it might be useful, and drawing from some of the things that Rajeev and Thomas and Sada have said, I thought it might be useful to try to place what I think is happening or what is at stake in that sort of geo-economic and geostrategic context. And the direct question really is, well, what is the actual threat or what is the actual challenge, particularly from China, that we're facing, and how is it going to affect our countries? The way I think about it, the threat of the problem is in a number of ways. And we have to thank Xi Jinping, because he sort of told us what it is that he wants to achieve. China wants to create an entire technological eco-operating system that stretches from East Asia all the way to Western Europe. Now, this ecosystem or operating system effectively means that it controls supply chains. It owns the most important technologies and patents. It determines technical, commercial, even legal rules and standards that govern the use of this technology. And this includes control over data and information and how this data and information can be used. So in this ecosystem, Chinese firms, and they can be public or private, they ultimately control by the party, and they ultimately serve the party's domestic and external objectives. Now, what does this mean? Why does the Communist Party want to achieve this? One reason is that it means that Beijing is in a unique position to dispense commercial opportunity and also economic punishment to other countries, just as the party does domestically. So in one sense, this is really what much of the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly the digital Silk Road component, is specifically about. Now, what about economies such as the ones we come from, the United States, or if Japan and India, Australia choose to sit outside this Chinese ecosystem? Well, China's plan, I think, is that these economies will be structurally disadvantaged in that they will have no choice but to rely on Chinese firms, on Chinese-based supply chains and technologies. And this is a deliberate attempt to reverse the dominance that the United States, Japan, and Europe has had for many decades, when they were the primary creators of value in global markets. And this is what I think Made in China 2025 is really all about. Now, how successful has China been in achieving this? And China likes to tell the world that it's almost there, because obviously if the narrative that its dominance in this space is inevitable, if that narrative takes hold, and clearly resistance becomes less likely. Now, there is good news, because there is still time for us to make some important decisions that can be decisive. So, for example, in key areas such as robotics and aeronautics, semiconductors, closed circuit chips, and cloud services, China still has very low market share domestically and internationally, and still heavily reliant on foreign technology and know-how. As a result, China is not yet the standard setter for high-tech and emerging industries in these sectors. So, for example, if you look at the roughly 80 or so technologies in the dozen categories corresponding to the Made in China 2025 plan, about 90% of the tech standards are set by non-Chinese entities, and it's the dominant entity that tends to set the standards. So overall, China is still a net technology and know-how importer by some margin. Now, what is it, very briefly, that the US, Japan, and India, and Australia could be seeking to achieve in this Geo-Tech context? I think to be successful, for China to be successful in meeting its objectives in this context, it needs four things. It needs investment at scale. It needs access to large and advanced markets. It needs an effective system of domestic innovation and competition. And it needs channels to develop or acquire technology and know-how. Now, China's state-led model where, and it's been discussed, where it throws money at things, it achieves the first condition, that is investment at scale. But the other three conditions that I mentioned are far more problematic for the Chinese for the moment. So I think the key way is to find strategic policies and methods to deny China access to capital, access to markets, and access to the technology that it needs in strategic ways. And I think this is where the United States, India, Japan, and particularly Europe comes into it. China mainly relies on the United States and Europe for capital in terms of outside capital markets. that can be fixed in various ways or that can be addressed. The greatest source of technological leakage, I think, probably comes from Europe. That definitely needs to be addressed. And I think the US is on that path now of restricting that kind of leakage to China in certain sectors. China needs the advanced markets of the United States and Europe to succeed commercially. They're not going to succeed just by dominating Central Asia or Southeast Asia in this Geo-Tech space. And as a vast and developing market, India in particular doesn't want to make the same mistake as Southeast Asia has been making. Southeast Asia and China are increasingly integrated when it comes to supply chains, but the problem for Southeast Asia is that the high value added component of the supply chains are increasingly moving out of Southeast Asia and into China. And this is precisely what China is also trying to achieve with India. This obviously puts Southeast Asia at a structural disadvantage, and it would put India at an enduring structural disadvantage. Moreover, I think Southeast Asian countries have allowed a lot of Chinese companies and brands a powerful foothold in their markets, as they essentially haven't priced in security concerns and a permanent disadvantage from entering into what I call this Chinese ecosystem operating system. But it's not too late. I think the better we can advance our ecosystem, whether it be a open source one that's been discussed or a partially closed one, but the better we advance our eco operating system, the more attractive it becomes for Southeast Asian countries in particular, and Australia for that matter, to pay the transaction cost of moving from the Chinese system to a more open system or our preferred system. So I've thrown some ideas out there, Eric, and of course happy to discuss further in the next half an hour or so.
It's very helpful, John. Thank you. Perhaps we can go back to Rajeev. You've given a lot of thought to the need to create an ecosystem that's democracy-led. And in your opening remarks, you talked about the redesign or reform of international institutions that enhance cooperation and trade and commerce and rules-based competition between democracies. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you think an agenda across the Quad countries might involve in the building of such an ecosystem, particularly one that prevents, as you have described, the leaks to authoritarian actors, but also one that helps to innovate and create real alternatives that can compete for a lot of the middle countries in Asia and beyond with the PRC technological sphere of influence?
Eric, there's a very simple answer to that, right? And I think John has done an excellent job describing where we are at. If you consider us the open system and the Chinese system as the Chinese ecosystem, I think we have a lot of catch up to do. We have a lot of catch up to do, not in terms of individual pieces of this, but catch up to do in terms of a cohesive, comprehensive strategy and a roadmap going forward. You know, the reason I brought the issue of institution, and I'm not a great government person. I don't like anything that looks like another layer of regulation. But I think to allow just the markets of these 4 countries to collaborate amongst themselves is not enough. I think the governments of these 4 countries and whoever else is part of the mix needs to drive this. I haven't really applied my mind to what the institution should be, but I know what it should not be. It should not be the WTO. It should not be the United Nations. It should not be a bunch of bureaucrats running around creating havoc. This has to be entrepreneur-led. It has to be business-led with semblance of government involvement in it. So I don't have a precise answer to that, Eric. But I think John has laid this out fairly clearly. And if governments, these 4 governments or the 5 governments or 6 governments come together and say, look, our mission is to now start defining, specifying, architecting, building, investing this open system. Let's call it the open system. and that would be the future for most of the world, and that will have most of the world have access to it, rather than this competing closed system. That is a good start, in my opinion, per se. The actual institutional structure in terms of whether it should be a building in Manila or a building in Sydney or DC or in Delhi, I don't know yet. I think that's something that we can discuss. But I think even if we just come together, and Ito-san talked about the Osaka summit, I think that was a great start. But India sat out of it, again, because we hadn't evolved our own thinking on privacy, data flows. So the reason I keep stressing on an institutional structure is I think that is the only way we can accelerate this and move this conversation from the fringes, from the academia and from the intellectual conversations that we have into mainstream political objectives for these 4 countries and the 5th or the 6th country, as the case may be, if you want to include Vietnam, if you want to include South Korea and Israel, etc.
Thank you. Tom, yeah, go ahead, John.
Oh, sorry, very quick. I just want to respond to something which Rajeev said, which strikes me as being correct about the open systems. The one thing the COVID-19 pandemic has done, I don't want to phrase it as one of the good things that have occurred, but in a sense, one of the learnings that we've had is that national institutions matter, right? I mean, we look at the pandemic, the initial spread of the pandemic and concealment of the pandemic in China, or of the virus in China, has focused the world's minds on Chinese institutions and Chinese practices, which in turn has focused the minds of many countries on what a Sino-centric economic or tech order would actually look like, and it's not an attractive picture. So from that point of view, the pandemic has given some motivation to countries like Australia and I would say India as well, to take these questions more seriously. And it does have to be industry-led, but there's got to be a government role. And this is where I think there is some movement being made, which I would encourage. So for example, the Five Eyes, Australia, United States, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK, are now starting to more actively discuss geo-economic and geo-tech issues, which they've never really done before. They're now talking about extending that discussion between the Five Eyes and the other 2 Quad countries. They're now talking about extending this discussion between Five Eyes, Quad, and the G7 and the so-called D10, which is the G7 plus South Korea, Australia, and India. So the point I'm making is that countries of similar institutions now realize that that is a natural coalition that is occurring. And that certainly should be encouraged when it comes to specific policies like export controls and so on.
Thank you, John. That's exceptionally helpful. Tom, this is a large question, but I know that you've written quite a bit on WTO issues, the prospects for reform, as well as industrial policy. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on this topic.
First, am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the elephant in the room in this discussion, especially if you bring up the WTO, is Europe. And we've all sort of been working to try to bring individual European nations and the Union itself into a more constructive discussion on how to deal with some of the issues that we're talking about. The pandemic, the behavior of China in the last 6 months has certainly, I think, moved a lot of Europeans more into a more open frame of mind about working with us to push back on China. That doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden going to have a great solution to the many problems of the World Trade Organization. I'm still a little bit pessimistic about that. I'm open and warm to John's idea of the 5 eyes and perhaps extending the 5 eyes. Another thing that I've been thinking about recently is, part of the competition with China is control of natural resources. And for instance, rare earths, minerals like gallium that go into semiconductors, battery, the ingredients that go into battery technology. China's very aggressive around the world and getting control of those resources. The 5 eyes happen to have most of the resources that we need, so it's just another reason of working with them. And also, in terms of cooperation, there are business efforts that we need to reinforce. John, I think, mentioned technical standards, and those standards are still set at business-led organizations. The Chinese are trying to politicize the international standards organizations, but we need to work with our businesses, I think, and have some involvement to push back on China in that realm. One example is in the emerging 5G open technologies. There's a new coalition based mostly in the United States called the Open RAN Policy Coalition, trying to, amongst other things, develop standards for more open radio access networks and virtualized networks. And I note that in addition to many American companies, the Cisco's, the Intels, the Hewlett Packards, the IBMs, more specialized firms like Mavenir and Altiostar, which help integrate virtualized systems. They are working, Reliance Jio is a member of that, Vodafone is a member of that coalition. You have Japanese companies, Fujitsu, NEC, NTT. So those are international business coalitions that I think are worth pursuing. And finally, just back to the WTO, I think what we're going to see going forward in the absence of these big ineffective rounds of negotiations, you're going to see plurilateral negotiations. And I've been warming more towards the United States rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership as one example of that. We could deal with data flows, for instance, in that context, and intellectual property theft, state-owned enterprises, and the like. So those are just a few somewhat random thoughts about how we can effectively work together.
Thanks, Tom. Particularly on issues like this, some of the strategic rationale of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, makes a lot of sense. And some of that fundamental rethinking, I think, needs to take place here in the United States about how to design plurilateral institutions and arrangements that can facilitate greater standard setting and exchange in the technological realm in particular. With that, I wanted to go to Sada-san. When we think about moving this discussion about AI and future data tech that serves human beings rather than controls it, when we think about moving that discussion from the fringe to a central part of our alliance's diplomacy, how do you think we can build on the success of Osaka? And where do you see are the next areas where standards and deeper discussion about the ethics of advanced technology and the standards by which advanced technology are deployed should focus?
Sure. And first of all, so I think I totally agree with what Johnson said and Thomas-san said with regard to the institutional settings of this digital policy. But having said so, I do want to add that we have incorporated in the G20 Osaka another very important concept, which is called interoperability among frameworks. That's a kind of concept where, so the frameworks is a notion kind of in contrast with regulatory or stringent rules. So because the technological development is so fast in this area, government has no way, the full capability to catch up with those technological development. So instead of having the stringent rules, we need some kind of the set of discipline among the government, not only the government, but with private sectors, academia, and as a community as a whole. So I think that respective governments, respective countries have to have come up with their own set of disciplines, but there have to be interoperability among those frameworks. So I think the best example is cybersecurity. So in the US, there is a cybersecurity frameworks under the NIST by Commerce. And METI last year, we published our version of cybersecurity framework completely in line with NIST cybersecurity frameworks. So we are having such kind of the plurilateral discussion. And in the case of privacy as well, as Thomas-san and Rajeev-san pointed out at the outset, I think the data free flow and the issue of privacy is so imperative in this ensuring that this digital economy. So our colleagues in the Japanese government is now talking with their counterparts at FCC in the States and also European Commission and elsewhere. So I think this kind of the plurilateral rulemaking process comprised of not only the government, but again, with private sector, it's so essential. And with regard to AI, I think you have noticed that the OECD has just launched a set of the plurilateral discipline making process called GPAI. So I think it's kind of the analogy with climate change. Back in the 2000s and 1990s, I think there was a whole set of discussion on climate changes at the venue of IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, which was consisted by not only the government experts, but also academia and industry people. And after the long range of this discussion on the methodology and the modality of climate changes, then there was a government-to-government negotiation on COP. So I think what we have to do now in this geotechnology and digital policy is we have to provide some kind of venue among government, academia, private sector people so that we can kind of share the common notion of trust and the necessary disciplines. So that's what we are now doing.
Thank you, Sada-san. John-san, could I turn to you perhaps for some concluding remarks and then to Rajeev-san?
I suppose one of the more helpful things I could conclude on is just is to point out one of the main concerns I still have, when it comes to this issue, and that is, as I mentioned in my remarks, China likes to propagate the narrative that it doesn't need the world, and in particular, it doesn't need the United States to succeed and prevail in this Geo-Tech rivalry. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, if you look at the advances in Chinese innovation in this space, most of it originated from outside. Even in today's terms, if you look at the R&D spend in China taken by private firms, around 80% of it is undertaken by foreign firms in these technological spaces. So I suppose what I'm really trying to say is, yes, we do need to bring our business communities along, but we can't leave it to the business community or the markets more broadly to work these issues out. We do need to, I hate to say it, but we do need to apply some restrictions and often even some coercive aspects in a legal sense on businesses to prevent that kind of technological leakage in particular sectors. So I'll leave it there, but this issue of technological leakage, I keep on going on about it because ultimately the Chinese know that they cannot succeed without that leakage continuing to occur. And this is one practical way, as long as we pick the right sorts of technologies, this is one practical way I think we can gain a lot of leverage on this issue.
Thanks, John. As you know, there's an enormous amount of movement here in Washington on Capitol Hill within the administration and also in the Biden campaign to talk about exactly what you described, how to develop the proper restrictions to prevent the PRC from establishing itself as the autarky, technological autarkical superpower that it wants to be. And to do exactly what you described. So I really appreciate it, and I hope that we can convene another panel soon to discuss all of this. Mr. Chandrasekhar, would you like the final word, sir?
So I actually would just like to compliment what John said. I think John said half what I would have loved to say, which is really there is this threat about the future of technology, and we need to respond, and we need to respond decisively and not just leave it to the business and the markets to decide the future of technology. But let me just step back and speak like somebody who's focused on the economy and where India should go and where I believe the world ought to go. And we want to be prosperous, we want to grow our economy, we want to do all of those things that most countries want to do. And I think if we even put that front and center as the objective, and then come to the conclusion that the future of technology is going to be an important determinant about the nature of our economy and the nature of our economic growth in the future, we will come back to the same conclusion that John came with, which is that it cannot be anymore left to business and markets to determine the future. We've made that mistake once as the world and as democracies and countries with WTO. We have created a Frankenstein with WTO. And I'm saying this out there, I'm quite happy to be contradicted, but I believe in this. And we should not make that mistake again. This is the time for us, and this is not really so much about being paranoid about China as much as it's about safeguarding our own future and writing the script of our future ourselves, rather than having China co-author it in a coercive manner. Both the economic model almost completely depends on redoing the trade regime that we have today. What form that will take, I don't know. But definitely, for sure, taking the initiative and control of technology and the future of technology back from this current diffused, leaky kind of a model that is only benefiting one nation to back to where it should belong, which is these nations, these open democracies of the world, where it originated. Innovation started here, and in my opinion, we should have extraordinary amount of influence on where this goes.
With that, thank you all. I hope that we can return to this issue in particular soon. And I really appreciate all of your input and insights today. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.